Hello, my name is David Sykes. I'm the Director of the Centre for Dementia Learning, and welcome to today's exciting webinar on an enabling environment in residential care. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands we're all respectively seated and acknowledge the traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders past, present and to our shared futures together. Really exciting to talk about this, such an important topic around the built environment. I know so many of you online, I'm sure, are aware now of the significant impact built environment can have on providing quality dementia care. And today's session is a really important one to be able to explore that issue in more depth. And to help us do that, we're fortunate to have Gary O'Toole, who's National Consultancy Lead at the Centre for Dementia Learning. So welcome, Gary. And Karen Camille, who's Program Review Coordinator, also at the Centre for Dementia Learning. And Karen's also been involved in the development of the new guidelines, which we'll talk to a bit further later on. So let's get right into it. My first question goes to you, Karen. Can you tell us a bit about certainly the existing environmentally friendly design principles that are in use currently, and also then perhaps talk about those new principles that I know have been worked on, and we're just waiting for those to be formally released by the government.
Yes, hello and hi everyone, and welcome to those who are online today, and thanks David. Very happy to talk through the 10 dementia enabling environment principles, but before I do so I just wanted to mention that there are a new set coming. So there is what is titled the National Aged Care Accommodation Principles and Guidelines. And these at the moment are sitting at consultation stage. So date or deadline for these to be, time frame for these to be launched is yet to be confirmed. In the next year certainly, but no date at this stage, still going through that process. So these guidelines, these new principles, aged care accommodation principles, will likely supersede the 10 dementia principles I'm going to discuss, but certainly these dementia enabling environment principles are the foundation. They're the foundation of these new principles and guidelines that are coming. Now, just a little bit of information about these new guidelines and principles. They will contain 4 main principles. There will be 31 design guidelines and then 221 implementation checklist items. So a lot of information there, but that will all be coming, as I say, that will come in the next year. So just to let you know, that will be something to keep an eye out for. But certainly let's go through now the current 10 dementia enabling environment principles. And these are based on the work of Professor Richard Fleming and Kirsty Bennett, and they have been around for quite a while and still so relevant. And they're evidence-based, and they're created from a vast review of research, literature and studies in the design space. So the first principle is to unobtrusively reduce risk. So that's looking at how we can keep the person safe without them knowing that we're doing so. So we're thinking about things like fences, gates, exit doors, other things like staff and clinical areas. So how can we camouflage them or not make them obvious? Perhaps we think about foliage or trees in front of the fence lines. We might think about painting the same colour of the door as the surrounding areas in the clinical areas so that they're not obvious. So that principle is about keeping the person safe in an unobtrusive way. The second principle is to provide a human scale. So that one is about what's the size, what's the space like for the person, how do they fit into the space, what's the scale and the size of the doors, the rooms, the corridors. And ideally best practice is the household model for people with dementia, which is up to 15 people, 15 residents living together, which is more of that house and the home scale rather than the bigger facilities if possible. So that scale and how the person fits into that is really important, and that's number 2. The third principle is allow people to see and to be seen. So can the person find places they may want to go? For example, if they're hungry, they want to find the kitchen, or can they engage in something by finding the lounge room? When they exit their door, they look this way, they look that way. What can they find? Can they find somewhere engaging to go? If they want to find their bedroom, can they easily do that? How can they see places that they may want to engage with, but also visual access for staff? So allowing staff to see easily into spaces, to see the residents, to be able to observe. Number 4 principle is about reducing unhelpful stimulation. We know that things like televisions, exit doors or entry doors that bang when they open and when they close, things like the trolley that's got a little bit wonky that clang, clang, clangs, you know, the trolley, the kitchen trolley, other overload of stimulation, not just sounds, but also sights to do with visual clutter. So a lot of signage that is perhaps clinical in nature and not relevant to residents. So how can we actually reduce this unhelpful stimulation? So sights, sounds, tastes, touch, smells. So it's looking at all those things and reducing what doesn't need to be there. And then number 5 is to optimise the helpful stimulation. So what are some things that are helpful? Obviously sounds of nature, appropriate music, coffee makers, bread makers, anything that really actually assists the person to optimise wellbeing. So how can we increase that? What can we actually do to make that helpful and to reduce the unhelpful, but to optimise what is helpful for all the senses? Number 6 is about supporting movement and engagement. So this is about assisting with wayfinding. So this is things like signage, personalisation of bedroom doors or other areas where residents would frequent. It's also looking at intuitive wayfinding features like having some artwork or a statue or a vase placed somewhere so that the person gets to know, oh, this object, when I see it, when I see the artwork, my room is right next to it, or I know the kitchen is next to this item. And obviously we want to keep those items there so it becomes that point where they can keep coming back to. That is a reminder of what's around there for them that they want to access. So that one is about assisting the person to find their way and navigate and be independent in that space. Number 7 is to create a familiar place, and this one is really important. So when a person living with dementia enters a room, and the question we want to ask is it obvious? What is the function of that space? Is it obvious to the person that it's a lounge room? Does it have items, furnishings and other features that are obvious to the functionality? So sometimes we have multi-purpose rooms, and that's tricky, but we also want to set up that room each time for whatever's coming, so it's obvious what's happening there. So creating that familiar place, a familiar space, asking the question, does it make sense? Is it obvious what the functionality is? Number 8 is to provide a variety of spaces, places to be alone, places to be with others. So providing rooms for larger scale groups, providing spaces for small groups, for individuals, for couples, going outside, for having friends and family. So having that variety where we can engage in different ways with others. Number 9 is to provide links to the community. Now we can do this in 2 ways. We can assist the person to maintain their links out in the community by transport and other supports, but we can also invite groups to come in and join us on site. So things like having a cafe, having a hair salon, play equipment for children, having multi-purpose rooms where we can invite groups to come in and to use some of our facilities. So we're maintaining those links with the community both by going out but also inviting others to come in. And the 10th principle is to provide opportunities for engagement with ordinary life. And this one is about what is the philosophy, what is the model of care of your home? Will it be one where residents are able to join in and participate freely with things like, if they want to, of course, making their own bed, setting the tables, being part of that everyday life? Or is your model of care something like Montessori based, or is it Eden alternative? What is your philosophy? What is your culture? So that's looking at what everyday life looks like for people living with dementia. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Karen, and I guess that's a really great comprehensive overview. And before I follow on with another question to you, Karen, just want to mention to you all that really encourage you to put any questions you may have into the chat box. And there is an ability to like those questions or comments or queries that you might want to put in there. That will help us, because that'll push the most popular question or comment to the top. That will enable our very experienced, very capable Sue Hines, one of our excellent facilitators, to be able to help curate what's most critical for our conversation today, given we only have a short period of time. But really encourage you to put those in there so we can, this is a chance for you to have those sort of burning questions, or even share your own experience of design and how you found that's worked or hasn't worked, and what that's meant for care, and also what you've been able to do to address some of those things. Karen, the Dementia Australia has its own environment audit tool, which is obviously based on the work of Richard Fleming and Kirsty Bennett, as you've indicated. Can you tell us a bit about how that works? Because I know we do a lot of that work with providers, and your role is actually certainly overseeing that whole piece.
Thanks, David. Yeah, sure. So we use the EAT, which is the environmental audit tool, when we're actually delivering our audits, and we deliver them on a national basis right across Australia, and we have done so for many years. And using this EAT, this environmental assessment tool, it actually assists us to come up with some really practical strategies that we're able to share with the organisation we're conducting the audit. So this actual tool, this EAT, actually helps to assess the quality of residential care environments for people living with dementia, and its purpose is to provide a framework for reviewing the environment, and also for identifying areas for improvement. So we want to make sure that the results, or the report that we create at the end of this audit process, is very practical in nature, and it certainly can provide lots of suggestions that can cover all budgets. So it's certainly available to anybody, and it's certainly very practical. But we know there is no perfect design when we're talking about dementia design, and even the best facilities have opportunities for improvement. But this EAT tool is good in assisting us to review the environment and to look for those areas of improvement. And when we conduct the audit, we come out to the organisation and we're on site for 2 hours. So it's best to actually be part of that environment and experience it at the same time as we're conducting the audit. And as part of that audit process, we actually are looking at common areas within a home, such as the kitchen, dining, the bedroom, the bathroom, the lounge room and the outdoors, and other areas. And we're looking at coming up with a score based on the principles, the actual validated questions that are part of the audit, to determine a score for each of those areas. And then based on that, we also provide suggestions for each of those areas on what are some improvements you might consider, and for all budgets. So it's certainly a very, very practical process. And as I say, it's available nationally, but using that tool assists us to provide such practical suggestions that can be implemented no matter what the budget. And the really important part of this process is that even the small changes can make a big difference. And that's really important, to, even if you can't do some of the big suggestions that we mentioned, there's always other practical, smaller, in the meantime, that are able to be implemented that do make that big difference. Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. And I know certainly in resi care across the country, there's a lot of ageing stock, obviously, that can be challenging to obviously refurbish and refit or relocate and all the rest of it. So in looking at the various environmental audits we've done over the years, what would be some of probably the three top, I guess, common things you see coming through those reports?
Sure. So three of the most common items, I guess, or issues we might identify in our audits over the years. And as I say, it's been over the years and there's similar issues. So there is those shared commonalities across aged care when we're looking in this design space, particularly in residential care. But the first one we see, often the first common issue we see or challenge is wayfinding. So looking at signage, is there appropriate signage? Now, we sometimes see lots of signage, but is it necessarily effective and is it actually helpful signage? And also that lack of personalisation that assists the person to find and navigate their way. So finding common places such as, if I'm hungry, how can I find the kitchen or find a cup of tea or something to eat? If I want to find the toilet, how can I find that? Where's the signage to support that? We know a person living with dementia isn't able to get that information from their brain, which obviously has damage due to their cause of dementia. So they need their answers to be around them, what we call cognitive ramps or supports, and that's what the signage really is, or other supports to assist with that navigation and independence. The second common issue that we see is lack of appropriate outdoor spaces or free access for the person to go outside. And this one, there's lots of ways we can introduce outdoor spaces, and we can also, no matter what space you have available, we'll have suggestions how to make that obviously more free from hazards and accessible, but also inviting or looking at bringing the outside inside. If you don't have much space outside, there's ways to use it effectively, but also methods of getting that same touch with nature in the outdoors. We can look at bringing that inside as well. So that one, certainly looking at the outdoors and the accessibility of that one, is the second most common one. And then the third one is that overstimulation, which is mentioned certainly in the 10 principles. About things like noise, levels of noise is often quite high. So things like TVs, buzzers, things like paging systems, cleaning equipment, vacuum cleaners, floor polishers. So sometimes there's an overstimulation for the person with dementia when we know that they can't focus away from those things. They can't decipher or understand what's going on due to those brain changes in dementia. So every source of sensory input becomes one big barrage on the person. Other things too, in terms of overstimulation, as I mentioned before, is that visual clutter. When there's a lot going on, there's a lot of features, there's also a lot of signage, particularly clinical. And during COVID, we certainly saw an increase in that, didn't we, with all the signage that was necessary. So that overstimulation is probably the third most common area or challenge that we see. Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. That's really interesting. And I guess the other thing I'd be interested to you to talk to is, what do you think of from that, what are the key things that you could think pro-artists could be doing better, I guess, from your experience with looking at those various assessments?
Yeah, certainly. And as I said, it's sometimes the small things that can make a change. So it's not always making those massive changes or having a big budget in order to do so. But certainly looking at that first common issue, which was the signage, is thinking about where the signs are placed. Often we place them too high, and a person with dementia, or even a person who is aging, who is older because of postural issues, looks downwards. So signage should be at an eye level for them, which is about halfway down the door rather than up high. It's thinking about, is there a clear picture to match the sign or the writing on the sign, on the text? And does the sign actually contrast the door that it's on? And, you know, just to think about, is it effective? And who is it for? And they're good questions to ask. Who is the sign for? And does this sign cater for the person that it's for? In this case, a person with dementia. But also to think about personalisation of spaces, such as the bedroom door, having pictures and photos familiar and relevant to the person. Also looking at different colours, contrasting colours on the door as opposed to the surrounds of the door, so the person can find their room due to this personalisation and also the colour contrast, and also using that colour contrast on other areas such as all communal toilets or other spaces that residents would access. So any space we want a person to access or use who is living with dementia, we want to contrast it to its surroundings. On the other hand, if it's for clinical, it's a staff only area, then we would camouflage it using the same colours on the door and the surrounds, so it becomes not of interest and the person then moves away to something of interest. We can also go down to even to the level of the doorknob, making it a doorknob that feels the same texture and same size as what they had where they used to live. So there's a lot of features we can put in place that actually assist with that wayfinding to assist the person to navigate their way and be more independent. And again, there's small things that doesn't necessarily cost a lot to look at that signage, and there's others that we can do you know, that may cost more, but there's still changes we can make within all budgets. For that second area about lack of outdoor space, we can certainly look at how we can use what space we do have, you know, making it safe in terms of free from hazards, making it even surfaces, looking at pathways that are clear and obvious for the person to follow, looking at engagement opportunities, so having an area to sit, some engagement opportunities like a raised garden bed or clothesline or other opportunities. But it's really about using the space you've got, because in a built environment we can't necessarily change the whole building, we can't knock down walls and we can't make those huge changes sometimes, but it's looking at the space we have and how can we better use that. Accessibility wise to outdoor spaces, we could look at automatic doors or easy push doors. We can also look at how we observe residents in those spaces. I know a lot of people say, oh, we're worried if people go outside they might fall over, and we're not there to watch or to observe all the time. So, you know, set a schedule perhaps where a staff member is going out every 10-15 minutes, or look at cameras, look at other ways that you can monitor your outside areas is really important as well. And as I said, sometimes we can look at how we can bring the outside to the inside as well to increase that sense of nature and increase that connection with the outdoors. And for that third point, which is about that overstimulation, the question we ask is, what can I turn down? What doesn't need to be here? What can we get rid of? Things like turning the television down, or getting headphones for those, wireless headphones for those who want to watch it, for others who want to be in the space, in the quiet. We can also look at things like buffers around the wheels of our trolleys. We can look at buffers on our exit and our other doors so they don't bang every time. We can also look at cloths under some of the crockery that we have on the trolleys, so when we're pushing it, it's not really loud, and it also reduces the sound. We can look at timetables for the cleaning in terms of when we use the cleaning equipment, the vacuum cleaners, the polishers and those other things. Look at the timetable and the scheduling for staff when they use those items, so they're not being used at times when it's busy. So that question of what can I get rid of? What doesn't need to be here? Looking at buzzers, can we turn off the sound, but we then have a pager system, or we're able to still visually see the numbers coming up? Pager system, do we look at other ways of communicating? So as I say, it ranges from the small to the big in terms of budget, but also that small difference can actually make a big difference.
Thanks so much, Karen. There's some really great suggestions out there of really how you can do, as you say, things with minimal cost, but can make a really profound difference to the environment and the impact it's having on people living with dementia. So I might at this point check in with Sue, our moderator, who's been looking at the questions coming in, and yeah, just hear from some of you out there as to some of the questions or comments you're putting through now.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, one of the questions is how much trialling is done with actual people living with dementia before implementation?
Well, that's an excellent point, Sue. And I know certainly when these design principles were developed, there was a great deal of research and evidence that went into those, and the research was very extensive. And I know that Professor Fleming certainly has been working in the industry for a very long time and had done so before the introduction of the principles. So he was certainly living and breathing I guess the impacts of the environment, and saw the need to actually look at designing and creating such principles. So certainly from a foundation level, from a creation level, there was certainly a lot of research that went into that. And certainly over the years, they have been updated. Also, there's extra tools that have been designed, and all of these have been created based on the experiences and the evidence and the research about the impacts of the environment on people living with dementia. So really it's in that research space that others have done, and we've drawn upon that to create and to keep adapting some of these. And as I say, with the new principles, there's even further research that's gone into those based on the consumer experience or the person living with dementia. Yeah.
And I think you did mention when you were talking about the audit tool, Karen, that it is a validated tool. So it's there is absolutely evidence that's sitting behind looking at those different components of and elements of design. So other questions or comments?
Yeah. What's the best evidence-based approach for disguising exit doors, in particular blending doors into surrounding versus door murals that depict? And I think this is probably one that a lot of people would like to know the answer to. It's a common one, that one, isn't it? So,
yeah.
Yeah, it is certainly a common one. And years ago, the practice was to use things like decals and the bookshelf wallpaper and painting murals over across the whole thing. And that certainly was known as best practice years ago. But best practice now is nothing fake. So because we know it's not, there's no dignity and it's not respectful when a person goes up to try and get a book from what looks like a bookshelf but actually isn't. Or there's a mural. The other day I was at a place and there was a mural. It was lovely and it had a picture of a rocking chair, and I actually saw a resident walk up and try and sit on the rocking chair very awkwardly and almost have a fall. So sometimes those things, as homely as they are, and as I say, we've used them in the past, but the best practice these days is nothing fake. It's better to just paint it all the same colour if you want to disguise it as an area that is not accessible for people with dementia to use or to access. So that what happens is if it's all the same colour, it becomes not very engaging, it's boring. But over here is something much more engaging, where we want the person with dementia to find and to explore and to engage in that. So the idea is nothing fake, in order not to trick people or make them, feel undervalued by trying to do something that, like hopping in for example, another example was the car that we used to have in the outdoor area, but it didn't have a motor, and people with dementia were sitting in the car trying to make it start, getting very upset. Why aren't we moving anywhere? Someone's stolen the motor. So best of intentions at the time. Yeah, or the bus stop, sitting and waiting for a long time, and the bus doesn't come. And again, it's just that whole dignity and autonomy that we want to particularly focus on. So I think nothing fake, but the best practice is to camouflage, but then create other points of engagement where we do want the person with dementia to go. Great question.
And Karen, it's interesting that point you made about if you don't want to, if you really want to hide it, make it look like everything else. I think sadly, I don't know if anyone else has had the experience in modern contemporary hotel land. I found myself the other day pushing on a wall when I thought I was going into the toilets because there was a sign on it and the wall looked exactly the same as the door was. So I guess that's a salutary lesson there for all of us, that good dementia design can actually improve accessibility and usage for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions or comments you've got there, Sue, before?
Well, probably just linked into that one. So disguising doors within the restriction of freedom of movement is ambiguous. Obviously, those with capacity can exit a door, but what if we are disguising the door? Should all those disguises be removed? I guess this probably comes a little bit into, is it classed as an environmental restraint or not if it's disguised?
And I think the main point here is, what are the other engagement opportunities? Like, we don't want that to be the focal point. So we want to provide engagement opportunities that the person wants to actually explore and be part of, rather than, and it is hard because people may come and go through those doors. So sometimes it is hard to, yes, you might do your best to camouflage it all, even down to the handle and the hinges. So the whole lot, same colour as the surrounds. But if people come and go out of it, it does make it hard. So we would then suggest, are there other doors that people could be using to come and go, so it's not as obvious that it is a door? But you know, you can only do your best, and certainly in design, we do have to also think about restrictive practices, most certainly. But looking at the most alternatives we can in terms of what other doors can be accessed, so that it's not so obvious as to what it actually is, that it is a door. So we do have to weigh up and we do have to balance all of those things, certainly, which does make it a little complex, but certainly following the guidelines, following restrictive practice guidelines as well, and doing our best to follow those and to engage them in other ways, in other areas, would certainly be recommended.
Thanks, Karen. Other questions? I can see them coming through, and that's great. And also a reminder to rate them if you want, to sort of push them up the ranking there. But keep those coming through. So.
Thanks.
Oh, so anything else you wanted to pick from the Q&A there?
The one was, does the EAT work within the facility audit accreditation process, or is it standalone?
I believe it is. Yeah, sorry, Sue.
No, sorry, carry on.
As I say, I believe it's standalone, certainly, but it would certainly be mentioned at time of, if there's an accreditation process or site visit going on. It would certainly be mentioned that it had been conducted, and would certainly warrant the assessor being very happy about that process, and also the results from that they may be interested as well, and also what, as a result of that, what changes may be part of the accreditation process plan going forward. Yeah.
And look, I know that certainly providers have used it as evidence during an accreditation process, as you say, Karen. So it certainly can be an important reference point there. Sue, any other?
There was just one that was asking about, can it be used for disability areas as well?
That is an excellent question, and yes, absolutely. We do use this for the disability sector. We also use other tools as part of Dementia Australia. We do audits in other spaces such as acute. So we do have some other tools that we use for acute care that we also use for the community space, you know, retail, business, museums, all that kind of space as well. But certainly the EAT tool does apply to disabilities, and we use it very successfully in that particular space as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Sue. And look, thanks for those questions that you've put through, and keep those coming. Certainly some of you are in questions I know about if you're thinking about whether your organisation would like to explore doing an environmental audit. Certainly one of our administrators will actually be posting a link in the chat where if you are interested in inquiring further about that, you can certainly pose that to us. So happy to help in whatever way we can in that regard, and it's just a really wonderful resource for your organisation, with all the pressures you have and all the time restrictions you have, to be able to, for us to be able to help you with at least identifying those areas. As Karen rightly said, some of that can be really relatively simple fix to obviously the more substantive pieces, which we know can sometimes require you to have board considerations of putting in funding applications and other aspects to actually enable you to, in 2, sometimes 3 years, to actually look at implementing some of those changes, but provides also a useful resource for board consideration, for exec consideration in those other contexts as well. I want to go now to Gary and really be interested in your reflections, Gary, on what are some of the common barriers providers actually experience in implementing some of the changes that Karen's taken us through.
Thanks, David. And in some ways, I think Karen and you have both stolen some of the things I was going to say. So I'll reiterate some of those, because I think some of the barriers come directly out of misunderstanding of the principles themselves. And I think the first barrier that I have come across quite commonly is a perception that this costs a lot of money. So with the Audit tool, the whole area, a whole memory support unit or a whole wing of an aged care facility will be audited. And I think sometimes there can be the perception we need to change everything. And I think Karen said it perfectly earlier, that small changes in dementia support can make huge differences to the lives of people living with dementia. And certainly I know the way that we put together the audit reports, we often recommend sort of low, no cost options, medium cost options, and, you know, major fit outs. So I think being aware that some of the good dementia enabling design doesn't have to be expensive, and it doesn't have to be dramatic, I suppose, in the changes that are made in a facility. You can start small and build up. One of the other things, and again, Karen sort of mentioned it, talking about the principles, the design principles. And I think sometimes there's a danger that we see good dementia design, good dementia enabling design, almost like a standalone principle. It's just for people with dementia. It's just for the memory support unit or for a facility that has a speciality in supporting people with dementia. And I think good design is good design. And when we get the design right for people living with dementia, we get design right for everybody. And I mean everybody. I mean people, residents who perhaps don't have cognitive impairment. I think of staff all the time. The times I've spent in residential aged care facilities been completely and utterly lost. Because the acacia wing looks exactly the same as the Banksia wing, which looks exactly the same as the, I don't know, the Grevillea wing, for families as well. So I think that idea that good dementia design is sort of a starting point. If we get that right for people living with dementia, we get it right for everybody who engages with that community. The third thing, and you'd sort of expect me as a dementia educator, I suppose, to come up with this, but one of the challenges I think I see organisations face who have undergone an audit and perhaps put in place a lot of the recommendations is that we forget that the physical environment is not a passive thing that people live in. We need to think about how our staff, our families, provided with education about how to use the environment to support people with dementia. An example I'm thinking of in a facility that I'm doing some work with at the moment, where they were going to put up the ubiquitous mural somewhere, and we managed to talk our way around what a dementia enabling mural would look like, and move from a mural to artwork that was familiar to the residents as a way of supporting wayfinding. What we failed to do was to inform staff and families about how they could utilise those familiar photographs or pieces or artwork around the residents' corridors to engage with the residents when a resident was wandering along or walking with a staff member or family, saying, "Oh, that looks like, you know, the Geelong Town Hall. Do you remember going to dances there?" So I think we sometimes put in place a range of dementia-enabling principles, but perhaps forget to put in the support for staff and families to be able to engage with some of those changes in the environment, knowing what they're for and how they work. Karen mentioned the car that's in the garden somewhere in lots of aged care facilities, and again often sit there being overgrown by weeds because nobody knows how to use it. It just sits there as a passive ornament. Now we can get into debates about whether cars are useful things to have in the garden. I'm not sure, but if you're going to have one, at least have a plan for how we use it. So I think those three things, being aware that small changes make a big difference, being aware that if it works for people living with dementia, it works for everybody, and also being aware that this stuff is not passive. It does need to be integrated into the model of care, into the way we do things around here. And again, that involves education for staff, for families, for residents even.
Thanks, Gary. I think that's a really good point about, I mean, the focus today is obviously on environment, but those other factors around really having a good understanding of dementia, well-educated staff, and good, strong leadership around that is obviously important. And, you know, I'd be interested to know from you, what are some of the real success stories you've seen come out of environmental audits where things have changed off the back of an audit, and what sort of difference have you seen that make to the care provided and the lives that people are living as a result?
Thanks, David. It's what are some of the benefits? And I think I'm thinking in terms of a package of changing dementia practice, and audit being one aspect of that. Again, that going back to that point I made earlier about the importance of education for staff about how we engage with people with dementia in this enabling environment. And look, I've seen some remarkable things just in the last few weeks. In fact, I was talking to the manager of a facility in another state. I won't say which state, but another state. I'm in Victoria, and she was saying that even after a month after putting in place some of the recommendations from an audit, plus again providing education for staff and families about how to utilise those changes, that she had gone from a position where she was having enormous difficulty staffing the unit to basically having to beat staff off with a stick because they wanted to work here, because it was an exciting, engaging, enriching experience for staff to work there. And that was because the lives of the residents had changed as a result of some of these often quite minor changes in the physical environment. Residents were more engaged, they were less distressed, agitated, they were more communicating with the environment, with staff, with families and residents. So it's interesting, I find, that the sort of ripple effects of something like those, like an enabling environment can have, not just again for people living with dementia, and certainly we can see, you know, you can get clinical data around the reduction in the use of antipsychotic medication, perhaps particularly PRN medications. You can see changes in falls, perhaps. I've seen increases in eating behaviours. And so weights of residents have increased, hydration levels have increased. All of those sorts of things are sort of clinical indicators that the person is living a good life. They feel secure, they feel at home. And that, I think that better life for people with dementia leads to a better life for staff and a better life for families. So it's that whole community ripple effect, I think, that is being most important, or one of the most significant things I've seen as a result of audits. Again, there's one thing to do an audit. You do need to do something about it as well. And I think we've sometimes seen where audits have been done and you come back 6 months, 12 months later and not a lot has changed. So I think for organisations to build the results of an audit into a bit of an action plan is really important. So yeah,
it's a really good point, Gary, about I don't think we always recognise that there are those multiple benefits to environment in terms of the staff context, as well as residents, as well as families and carers obviously coming in. So yeah, sorry, you were going to say something before.
Oh, as those who know me know, I love a good slogan, and that slogan, that if it's good for people living with dementia, it's good for everybody. And I think it's a slogan, but it's really true, and a measurable change that you can see often, yeah, within the whole support community, I suppose.
Which goes back to your earlier point about, just that, good design is good design. And, if we're a bit apropos of my comment about my hotel experience, that was particularly challenging for me to find the entrance. So, I think there's really flow-on effects to a range of contexts. So I might throw to you at this point, because I know there's some further great questions and comments coming through.
Yeah. One of the questions is, how do we encourage management to provide open access to outdoor areas in the dementia-specific unit? And there's been a couple around that. How do we get management to come on board with this if they're reluctant to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Great question. And I see there's got about 4 ratings against that one.
Yeah.
So a number of you have obviously, that's touched a nerve. Can I just say one thing before I throw to perhaps Gary and Karen to respond to this one? I think the other critical point, we've talked about environment, we've talked about obviously the training and support of staff. The other critical thing is obviously leadership, leadership and the culture that leadership creates. And so if that's not there, then it doesn't really matter what you do with environment and other things. It's not going to have those kind of fantastic diverse outcomes that Gary's talked about. And I think that leadership needs to be committed to things like doing things differently, how you enable that access to outdoor areas. I think we've all certainly seen, I know I have, positively amazing outdoor areas in aged care facilities that you rarely see people out in. And I suspect the 5 people now who've rated that would share that sort of concern about how do you do that, and how do you do that in an appropriately safe way, given that we've certainly there is a level of risk obviously with being out there, and we know that the compliance that's there for aged care providers makes that a really tricky thing to do when you're short-staffed and all of those other pressures on you. But it is possible, it is doable, and I might at this point perhaps throw to you, Gary, first for your thoughts and reflections on where we've seen approaches to that have enabled that to occur.
David, my background, as you know, is nursing, and I just want to make a quick clinical point, is that I think one of the reasons why we find it challenging to provide access to the outdoors for older people in aged care, and particularly people living with dementia, is that we fear that they will fall, and that's the reason given most often for why the doors are locked. From a clinical point of view, we know the research shows very clearly that the very strategies that we're using to prevent falls locking the door, in fact, is one of the quickest ways that you can to increase the risk of falls. Because now we have a person perhaps with cognitive impairment who wants to go outside. It's important to them. They need to get into the fresh air, the sunshine, and we've barred their access, which just increases their anxiety. So now, instead of happily sitting outside under a tree, they're pacing up and down within the lounge room or their bedroom or the hallways, trying to find a way to get to what they need. And that we know that will just increase their risk of falling. So just from a clinical point of view, I think it's very interesting sometimes to reflect, are we using evidence-based strategies to achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve, in this case, preventing falls, or do the strategies that we use, in fact, increase the risk for people?
I think the other thing, just on that one, Gary, and I know this is not going to answer the question about how you achieve it, but I know certainly for a number of years now in the Dementia Support Australia data that they pull from their obviously supportive aged care providers around change behaviours, access to outdoor areas used to be certainly up there, and I think about the top 3, top 5 possibly, of triggers for change behaviours. I know myself as someone who is office bound, and I usually get outside on the weekends for exactly that reason. I can imagine I'd get pretty stir crazy if I didn't have the chance to get outside. But there are real challenges for providers in achieving that. What advice, Gary, do you think you'd be able to offer in how you enable that to occur when there's staff shortages and other pressures, and to enable that to really be something that people can do?
I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, Dave, and say I'm not quite sure that we have a lot of choice anymore with the changes in the accreditation standards, as the new rights-based rewrite of the Aged Care Act occurring. I think we just have to find ways of facilitating access to the outdoors. The whole notion of dignity of risk. And I think the aged care sector is seeing a revolution in the way in which we think about risk. We think about our duty of care, even, which is, I think, sometimes a much misunderstood notion. And I know I haven't given you any practical examples, but of what we can do. Make the outside area safe to be in, provide people with something to do in the garden. I was thinking before about some of the garden designs, and in that notion of environments speaking to us. And I go out into the gardens in lots of aged care facilities, and is there anything for me to do when I get out there? There might be a garden, but is there any way in which I can water something without having to talk to 3 people? So if we're providing people with something to do, I think that reduces the risk of falls, if that's the concern that we have. I'm sure Karen's got some more practical suggestions, but I don't think we've got a choice anymore.
Yeah, and thanks, Gary. And perhaps just before I throw to Karen on that, one thing I know we often talk about is how do you engage maintenance staff, gardening staff, catering, etc. staff in supporting people. Obviously, that's not their role to provide care, but if you give them a level of knowledge and understanding around dementia, that can actually empower them to be some really great advocates and to potentially provide some level of assistance, even in an outdoor context where, your gardener's out there and has to be out there working anyway. Now, they're not there to necessarily provide care, but they can provide a useful pair of eyes on the person. They can potentially give them something meaningful to do as part of being out there. We're picking up your point, Gary, so that they can spend some time outside. You're not having care staff necessarily out there at that point in time, but the cautionary thing for me with saying that is you need to give those staff the necessary support in being able to do that. You can't just expect them to do that straight up. But they are working in aged care for the same reason everyone else is. They want to, connect with and improve the lives of older people. Karen.
Yes, and I guess continuing on from that point, David, is who we can actually, what resources we have that we can tap into that will assist us with observation in outdoor areas. And I think that is probably the crux of it all, is how can we ensure we're out there, that we're seeing that people are okay, and that's the main concern, as you've mentioned. So I think, and I know Sue mentioned to me earlier today, she was doing an audit and then heard from the staff later on that they'd put in place a schedule that every 15 minutes a staff member would go outside and just observe. And we have other resources that we can train up, that we can assist in terms of going outside if you notice this or something happens. This is the procedure to come back and who to see. So we can use volunteers, we can use family members that are there if they're willing to do that as part of their visit, is they will go outside with their loved ones, spend time outside, and then they're outside, there's eyes out there. So I think there's other resources that we can use to actually have that surveillance, so to speak, or observation, visual access of the outdoors, to enable to, not have to worry so much that this might happen to somebody. If we've looked at all the principles, we've looked at the recommendations, the suggestions on how to make it as safe, hazard-free, using other principles, engaging, and then we have that schedule of someone coming out on a regular basis, then I think that's the best that we can do. And like Gary said, it is certainly a requirement now, and it's helpful for everybody. It makes a big difference. So what other resources do we have that we can utilise? Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. And look, I'm conscious now of time. Maybe I can just throw to each of you for any closing comments. Karen, anything else you wanted to add that you feel is a real important take home for people in this context?
I think we've said it all, to be honest, but I think that small changes do make a big difference. So it is definitely worth going through the process, which is a small cost in terms of big gain. Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. Gary.
And I'll follow Karen's lead and repeat something that was said earlier. And if it's good for people with dementia, it's good for everybody in our community. I think we know 80% of people with living in residential aged care possibly have a diagnosis, but for the other 20-30% and the staff and the families, good design is good design.
Sue, anything final from you or that you want to pick up from the conversation that's been happening online? And some great questions, by the way, some really great comments. And
yeah,
so
there's
thank
been
you
some
all.
Great questions coming through, David. I guess for me as well, I just always like to say that you can never prevent somebody falling, you can only reduce the risk. It doesn't matter whether they're in residential care or not, people are still going to fall. We've just got to do things to reduce the risk for that. We've just got probably one more question, which I thought was about why is it not mandatory to have wayfinding in residential care, that someone's been to multiple places and it doesn't seem to be in place and it doesn't seem to be part of the building guidelines for that, and I totally understand that it should be just an integral part of helping somebody find their way.
Yeah, really good point. And obviously the important work that we've been involved in, that Karen's mentioned about the development of the new accommodation framework, I think will be a key step towards that. Anyone involved in building regulation will know that takes years to influence that. I've come from the disability sector, and certainly I know that took years to actually introduce those kind of mandated requirements we all kind of take for granted now. If you go to any community centre, you'll see appropriately wide, areas and that sort of textured things when we on pavements when you're going up to cross the street, etc. So still a long way to go with that, but I think there are some important steps towards that. I do agree with the questioner on this, is it should be mandated, it needs to be mandated. and we do have a long way to go with a lot of the ageing stock that's out there, but there is some important steps towards this, I think, and probably as you would have heard with Karen's opening comments about the 10 existing principles, obviously simplifying that to the 4 that are coming will obviously help with a lot of that process as well, and I think make that easier and more accessible as well for providers and others and builders and architects to understand that. Sadly, we all see too often that new facilities are built with poor consideration of those design principles, which just shouldn't happen in this day and age. Look, please thank our presenters today, Karen and Gary, and also our moderators, Sue. Special thanks to Jim and Taylor behind the scenes, who've also been making sure this runs through smoothly. And most importantly, I think, to all of you for contributing to today's really valuable discussion. Some closing points for me. Certificates will be sent to those who logged in via a Microsoft Teams account. So if you need those, look out for those. I think this has already come through the chat, but certainly today's webinar will be available within 2 weeks of today's event up on the website. And I think this is also in the chat, and Taylor's posted that there, but a survey is there, and we really encourage your feedback on what you find useful about these webinars. We know that we get some really good feedback, particularly on how we can make them fairly short and very practical. And with that emphasis on short and practical, I'm conscious I'm about a minute over time. But look, thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for your contributions to today's discussion. And if you can, reiterating Gary's comment, if you can get it right for someone living with dementia, you can certainly get it right for others. Thank you very much.